I'd like to welcome you from all over the world. I'm Gary Null, broadcasting and video streaming live from our studios in New York City. This is a continuation of a measured look at the official report of the 9/11 Commission. We are only exploring what we can prove. We are not speculating. We have had many programs, and I'm going to share some information with you now in a moment that I'm pretty sure most of you have not heard. But first we're going to Richard Gage. As I mentioned earlier, he is the San Francisco-based architect specializing in large building construction and steel frame structures, and he is also one of the original members of the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Nice to have you with us today.
Thank you, Gary. It's just great to be here with you. It's an honor. Thank you.
Let's begin by you giving us an update on new and relevant investigations and findings into the collapse of the World Trade Center towers 9/11 that we would not be aware of.
Yes. Well, first of all, I've been an architect for over 20 years, and 5 years ago I heard on the radio for the first time an alternative theory as to how these Twin Towers came down. Not only that, and this was on Pacifica Radio in Berkeley, KPFK, and what I heard was just astonishing. It floored me. There was all of this evidence that David Ray Griffin was putting forth that nowhere, not a clue had I had, because on 9/11, those buildings came down. I was certainly horrified and quite curious about how they came down, but the experts came out and said these buildings fell due to structural weakening of fires, and by fires and jet plane impacts. And not only that, they had an explanation which didn't make any sense for the third skyscraper to collapse on 9/11 in the afternoon of 9/11. This was World Trade Center Building 7. This was a 47-story skyscraper that had a few small fires here and there in the building, and at 5:20, it drops like a rock at free fall acceleration straight down almost into its own footprint. And this is extraordinary. I mean, we've seen this before many times, but only when done intentionally in a controlled demolition. And indeed, that's what it exactly looks like. And yet we're told by officials that this building came down due to normal office fires, which is just ludicrous. So we now have 1,500 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation into all three World Trade Center high-rise collapses. And that is based on the evidence for the controlled demolition of all three buildings, which is not just the behavior, in the case of Building 7, that it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, and NIST, the official, in their official report, says that, we didn't find any evidence of explosives. And when pressed, they acknowledge that they never looked for evidence of explosives. Well, given the explosive nature of its drop and which is really an implosion, and which can only be can only happen if all 80 columns on each floor of at least 8 floors are simultaneously removed, so that the building can drop as fast as a bowling ball falling off the side of it. And this can only be done, of course, by explosives. So any architect, engineer, or other person will see that readily. When we can get them in front of the evidence, they agree with us by a show of hands, because we have given this presentation now in over 200 times in 23 foreign countries and over 40 American cities.
Tell us something new today.
Yes. What they're talking about in the case of the Twin Towers is the very explosive nature of these towers. The 4-ton perimeter wall units are hurled at 70 miles an hour instantly out of the side of the towers, landing over 600 feet away. A tremendous lateral displacement of all of this material in a 1,400-foot diameter around each tower. We would expect gravity to work downward. 110 floors we would expect to be stacked up, not neatly certainly, but what they're talking about is the fact that there are no floors found stacked up in the photographs or videos of either of these towers, just a two-story pile of core columns, perimeter columns, etc. They're talking about the explosions that are occurring 20, 40, even 60 stories down below this zone of destruction, if you will, up above. Highly focalized, pinpoint, accurate, violent ejections that are expelled at 160 to 200 feet per second out of the sides of the Twin Towers. They're talking about the instant pulverization in waves starting at the point of jet plane impacts in these bands of explosions like the first responders described, which the New York Times had to sue the city of New York to get them to release in August of 2005. These oral histories of 500 first responders, where 100 of them are talking about sounds of explosions, flashes of light at the onset of the destruction of both towers, resulting in 90,000 tons of concrete being pulverized in midair to this fine dust which landed all over New York in a 3-square-mile area. They're talking about what officials have found in that dust, which is tiny molten iron, previously molten iron microspheres, which constitute up to 6% of that dust in various places. The USGS documents this. Well, first of all, it's molten, or it's iron. Where does the iron come from? It's not steel, melted steel. Molten iron comes from the byproduct of thermite. Thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. And we have the evidence in the spheres found by scientists of thermite itself, traces of aluminum, manganese, and barium in some cases, in addition to the molten iron. And iron takes tremendous heat to melt, like twice the amount of heat produced by the jet fuels or the office fires. So the official story cannot even account for the massive heat which is required to melt this iron, and the pools of what they called molten steel, the first responders, the structural engineers, the cleanup workers, found in the piles underneath all 3 buildings. In tremendous heat, up to 3,000 degrees it takes to melt iron, and they couldn't put out these fires, in fact, for months as a result, even though they're bathing them in a bathtub of water. So this is among the evidence. In addition, though, a small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen finds and documents the small red-gray chips in all of their samples. The red side of these chips is composed of extremely small particles of iron oxide and aluminum powder. They're 1,000 times smaller than the human hair diameter. And so these are nanoscale particles of intimately mixed iron oxide and aluminum, which are the ingredients of what? Thermite. And so what happens when they put this in a heater at 420 degrees centigrade, about 1,000 degrees, they ignite. What do they produce when they ignite? Iron microspheres. The same iron microspheres that are found by the USGS in all the World Trade Center dust. So this loop of evidence is cohesive and self-confirming. This is documented in a peer-reviewed paper, by the way, which is uncontested in the last 2 years in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. So this has to be investigated. And that's why we have over 1,500 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. This evidence is real. It must be dealt with squarely by not only government, media, but the American people who have to come to terms with the implications of it, which are what?
Richard, I appreciate you giving us these insights. I want to share some additional insights for this audience. I'm quite sure this audience, with maybe a few exceptions, are not familiar with this. I want to share some insights from a article from Senior Editor Duff, and this is from Veterans Today. It deals with a man who you know named William Rodriguez, and he was the one who helped save hundreds of lives, and he was the last person to escape alive from the World Trade Center towers. Now, if you just mentioned that we need to become awakened to the fact that we have been given the wrong information. I don't believe in speculating. I believe in dealing with the facts first. And then once you have facts that are irrefutable, then you ask, all right, how is it possible if we have these irrefutable facts, how is it possible that the official investigation chose not to acknowledge any of this? And that means then you're dealing with a cover-up. Then you can go into plausible scenarios. But here is the issue. First, let's get some background. This is the man who was a decorated hero. He was employed, according to Duff, at the World Trade Center for 19 years. He was a maintenance worker. He was the one who worked in keeping and the safety and upkeep of all the stairwells within the 110-story North Tower. But on the morning, and this is where it gets interesting, of 9/11, Rodriguez was the only person at the World Trade Center site with a master key to the North Tower stairwell doors. And for the fire containment purposes, only doors on every fourth floor were normally left unlocked. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, he personally rescued 15 injured persons from below the main lobby and carrying them to safety. And having evacuated the injured from the basement levels, he rushed back into the tower and led firefighters up the stairwells, unlocking doors to various floors. As they ascended, he aided in the successful evacuation of hundreds of survivors. I need to say this was a great risk, as it was to all of the very noble and heroic people who worked together, firefighters, police officers, first responders. And he entered the structure 3 times and even rescued people trapped between floors in elevator cars by lowering ladders down into the shafts. And having helped everyone he could find to safety, he finally exited the building, only as the building was collapsing and he dove under a fire truck, and a police officer across the street saw him do that, and 2 hours later, the whole thing was covered in this dust. They were able to get him out. And he received a special citation from President Bush. He received the Special Commendation of Valor at a special White House ceremony. And then the White House, here's what becomes interesting. The White House and top officials within our government began to explain to him that he could be a major force in politics. They were willing for the Latino community if he just went around the country and told the official story. And initially he did tell the official story. Now for the real story. Please listen carefully, everyone. This is fully documented. Everything that you're going to hear, as reported to Mr. Duff, is accurate. Rodriguez and a handful of co-workers who were down in the basement at the time of the attack actually heard and felt huge explosions beneath their feet in the lower basement levels. Now, this in and of itself is an anomaly and should have been the cause for serious investigation. It is the timing. Again, the timing. Please listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you, because no major media has ever covered this. The first of these explosions in the basement, which were really strong, occurred 7 seconds before the plane struck the tower. And they were so powerful, they literally threw Rodriguez upwards, clean off the floor, as parts of the false ceiling collapsed onto and around him. And Rodriguez heard and felt at least 3 explosions going off down in the basement levels within seconds of each other prior to the plane hitting. absolute pandemonium broke out with screams of bomb, bomb, rising above the din as terrified workers scattered in all directions, frantically seeking ways to escape. Now, mind you, there were a total of 6 basement levels. Level 2, immediately below him, was the apparent location of the first explosions, and that was the mechanical floor. And you couldn't walk on that mechanical floor. It was a restricted access area. But the bombs were by no means confined to the basement levels. And during his subsequent rescue efforts on the upper floors, Rodriguez claimed he heard explosions going off all around the building. Now, Philippe David, a colleague who was working at the far end of the basement, level 1, across from Rodriguez, fell victim to the second explosion. David was walking towards the supply room when the entire wall suddenly exploded in front of him. Burned beyond recognition, David managed to stagger towards Rodriguez, and he took one look at the man, and he just froze. The skin on the face had virtually peeled away, exposing raw pink flesh, and the burnt skin on his outstretched arms were hanging, he said, quote, like sheets of loose cloth. Now, David was the first casualty whose life Rodriguez saved by carrying him up to paramedics at street level, after which he returned to the basement. Mind you, this is in the basement. Police told him not to. He went down there. These explosions happened before the planes hit. Now, you got the 9/11 Commission hearings. At a closed door hearing, Rodriguez testified under oath that explosions were going off in the basement of the North Tower before the first plane impacted the building. He explained in great detail to the commissioners the numerous cases of serious injuries he had personally witnessed that were caused by these explosions. He even provided the panel with a list of first-hand witnesses to the explosions, people who were ready to testify under oath. And one of the individuals Rodriguez recommended the panel summon was a fellow employee, John Mongello. Now, Mongello was in the lobby of the neighboring South Tower when the first aircraft plowed into the North Tower where Rodriguez was located. It would be another 16 minutes before the second aircraft would rip into one of the other tower. Now, yet within a minute of the first plane hitting the North Tower, and this you haven't heard before, an elevator in the South Tower exploded to smithereens right before Mongello's eyes. Mongello and others were literally blown backwards by the blast as people, many horribly burned, began to run, shrieking in pain and shock and sheer terror. Thick black smoke would be seen billowing out of the now exposed elevator shaft, and what was behind that? A pungent smell of gunpowder. Again, just as with the North Tower, this explosion occurred inside a building that had not yet been struck by a plane. How could a plane crashing into the North Tower possibly have caused elevators in the South Tower to explode? The 9/11 Commission chose not to investigate. Worse, to his utter disbelief, Rodriguez later discovered that his statements were completely omitted from the official record. As a result, not one word of this decorated hero's startling testimony appeared in the 9/11 Commission report. And that was told, we were told, the whole world was told in the official media, told the official story that it was the definitive study. Furthermore, Rodriguez was told emphatically, do not speak about those explosions to anyone, because if you do, you will be inviting problems because there's still another investigation going on. So he held to his mouth. Now, so Rodriguez was stunned to find that his testimony was among those marked restricted, thus inaccessible to the public. In regard to the World Trade Center building that you just mentioned, the 9/11 Commission report again mentioned absolutely nothing about this 47-story skyscraper's sudden and unbelievable collapse, nor did it mention a word about the numerous eyewitness accounts of multiple explosions within that building. Not one word. As with the explosions reported in the North and the South Towers, 9/11 Commission completely ignored this shocking event as well. So this is what went on And then some very bizarre things began to happen. Those people who heard the blast, those people who were there, began to have some problems. They began to die. And this is at a time when they had all agreed that they would take their message public. So now you had people dropping dead, and it wasn't long that Rodriguez got his wake-up call. Kenny Joneman, another of the close friends and former World Trade Center colleagues, who had been in the basement with him when the bombs went off, and he was now working on behalf of the community of Hispanic victims and survivors and their families, had decided to contact everyone he knew who had been present at the World Trade Center that day so he could record their personal experiences on video. And during the lengthy interview, Joneman recounted his experience in great detail. He held back nothing. He had made it his personal mission to tell everyone he knew and anyone else who had listened that he had seen, quote, floors blow up in the basement before, I repeat, before the plane hit. 3 days after he did his interviews, he committed suicide, gunshot to the head. But he was happy. He was positive. He was motivated. He had truth from other people who were telling their stories. Not only did he commit suicide, but what happened to those interviews? And this is a frighteningly reminiscent of Barry Jennings, a former New York Housing Authority emergency coordinator and a key 9/11 witness who suddenly died of unknown causes days before the release of his amended report on the collapse to the World Trade Center No. 7. Jennings is on the record stating unequivocally and emphatically Building 7, quote, explosions were going off all over the place while the Twin Towers were still standing. Jennings also stated during an interview that he was, quote, stepping over bodies in the main lobby of World Trade Center 7 as he was being led out by firemen. The lobby, he testified on video, quote, looked like a bomb had gone off inside of it. Now, he was in excellent health, and suddenly he died at 53 mysteriously. And then you had a documentary producer who commissioned, Dylan Avery, who commissioned a private top detective to investigate Jennings' suspicious death and the subsequent disappearance of his wife and 2 children. Within days, the man returned Avery's check and told him, I'm not doing this. And then there were others to die. There was the Dutch demolition expert, Danny Jawinko, president of Explosives Demolite BV and a leading Dutch-controlled demolition company. And on July 18, 2011, while driving home alone in his car, his vehicle suddenly accelerated and swerved off the road and crashed, and he died instantly. So it seems as though the people who were eyewitnesses to the explosions are all now dying. Gee whiz, doesn't that sound a little familiar? That's just to give the people in this audience an idea of what they haven't heard, that is fully documented, that is a matter of record, but the American public doesn't know this, the media won't cover it, and so the cover-up continues. Final thoughts from you.
Well, in fact, the FBI had as their working hypothesis explosions in the building because they had seen and documented these explosions, but as well, Gary, they seized vehicles inside and outside of World Trade Center, the complex, that had explosives in them. So indeed, the whole story from the FEMA report, which came after the 9/11 Commission report, and then the NIST report, has been completely cleared of not only the evidence and eyewitnesses and stories of explosions, but also the NIST report ejected the FEMA report, Appendix C, which documented the melting of beams, the hot sulfur corrosion attack of steel, the intergranular melting with molten iron on the pieces of steel that were managed to be saved. Most of it, of course, was destroyed in a criminal act prior to the reports coming out. This steel was sent to China for recycling. So you're absolutely correct. There is massive evidence of cover-up here, and a new investigation is absolutely required.
Richard, one other piece of important information from Rodriguez, that 2 weeks before this happened, 3 weeks before, he began to see people in the elevator, but never taking the elevator, but in the elevator shafts and in the stairwells, that he had never seen before, always dressed in the white suits. And he knew everyone in the building. He didn't know any of these people. Also, in one morning, this is a week before the 9/11 attacks, he was he was cleaning up in the stairwell, and I believe it was the 34th floor. Now, that's a completely empty floor, not a single piece of furniture, nothing. And yet he heard this giant noise, as if someone were rolling a giant container, and he heard it for several minutes. And he thought, that's strange. Who in the world will be on the 34th floor? It's empty. Now imagine what you could do if you had an entire floor that was empty, and that you could get to all the beams, and you had access to all the elevator shafts.
Well, in fact, there was an elevator modernization going on the 9 months prior to 9/11, and that gave the 85 employees of ACE Elevator, who had this contract, up to complete access to all the core columns and beams throughout the building. So the 34th floor is more speculation, but a real investigation of this elevator company and what they were actually doing in there, would have given them the perfect cover to plant these explosives without being suspected by the tens of thousands of occupants in these buildings.
Well, also, he did not recognize any of the people, and they weren't on anyone's manifest. They weren't on a work manifest. So then, on another upcoming program, I don't want to do it today, I want to find out how someone could have done this. But we're building pieces, taking one piece of the puzzle at a time. So we have an empty floor that is perfectly positioned, that if someone were to set off charges, it would have been at a level and a way that they could have done. And he's hearing something big, something very big, being moved around that room, and there shouldn't have been anyone on the floor. There was no rental of anyone on that floor, so who was on there that day when it was shown that no one had signed in to be in there? Richard, Gage, we're out of time. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being on.
Thank you, Gary. My pleasure.
And he is with AE911truth.org, and we will continue. This does not dispute my previous guest who was on. I believe they are both correct. But I will deal with how they can both be correct. With energy forces, I believe there was a redundant program involved. I will deal with that on an upcoming program.